sorry, I messed up again. I figured out what I was doing wrong and how to fix it. But obviously, my current state, I didn't follow that. So this is part two. This is week week 6, lecture 2, part 2. And I'm sorry, and I'm struggling a little bit here. We have his own account of his Reformation discovery. It's late, though, and this is on the slide that says passes righteousness. And the first entry there is Luther's account of 1545, which is when it dates from. Because aside from the table talks, and a couple mentions in the table talks, the only full, let's say, official account Luther gave of his own theological breakthrough and discovery was in the preface to the first volume of his collected works in 1545. Now Luther dies in 1546, so this is towards the end of his life. And I forget which publisher it is, but they want to publish his collected works as Opera Omnia, and the first volume was about to come out, and they asked Luther for a preface. And it's a fantastic preface, because here already in 1545, and all kinds of things were going on in 1545, and I'll be talking about a lot of those in the next several lectures, what happens between 1520 and 1545. He claims a couple of things. One thing he claims is he wishes that all of his works would be burned. He said, all of my works should be burned except for 2. One being on the bondage of the will, De Servo Arbitrio, which was part of his debate with Erasmus. And the other was his small catechism. Now, you'll be reading a small catechism in a week or two. And he said, those are the only 2 works. He said, all the others you can just burn and get rid of. There are much better works out there, especially Philip Melanchthon's Loci Communes, which I'll be talking a little bit about in a subsequent lecture. But he said, but I know that they're going to be published anyway, whether I want them to or not. And so I at least want people to know how it all came about and how it all happened. And that's when he gives his account of his progress from an early member of the Augustinian order through to his theological discovery, and then the beginning of the indulgences controversy, and his break from Rome. Now we have to keep in mind this is some 25, 30 years after the fact. Memory is an issue. That's one point. Second point is that it's a very difficult preface and passage, a particular passage, to interpret. I talk about that in the book, so I'll leave some of those details, because Luther starts at one point in 1519, he goes back, and then he kind of works his way back, and then it comes with a different point, and it's very difficult. And it's been, in some ways, again, with this over a century-long attempted to date his discovery based on this preface. Most scholars had given up and said, we can't use it. We're just going to say, okay, by 1518, he had it. He probably had a number of discoveries along the way, and that was that. Now, let's look, though, a little bit about what Luther says. We'll talk about the dating. I'm not going to say that I can date it based on this. You can read about that in chapter 3. But what's important here is, how does Luther describe his discovery? He describes his discovery as follows. He says that he was always struggling to understand the words of Paul in Romans 1, 17 and 18. I don't have the text memorized, but it's the one wherein we find the just man shall live by faith. There we go, justification by faith. The just man shall live by faith. And Luther said, what is this? I've already said, I've already pointed out in Latin, justus, just, or just man, or justitia, justice, is the same as righteousness. So if we talk about the justitia Dei, we're talking about the justice of God, or the righteousness of God, as the same term in Latin. And Luther was struggling to understand and to find a righteous God. That was what he had to deal with the question when he first entered the monastery in Erfurt. What are you seeking? He says, I was thinking, God's mercy and yours, because God's mercy was always seen as the balance with God's justice or righteousness. So how can we find a merciful, loving God when we know that God is just and righteous, and justice is this act of justice? And Luther always said that, he was working on this, and he used to hate the concept, the righteousness of God or the justice of God, because he always viewed it as an active justice or an act of righteousness. He viewed it as the righteousness or the justice by which God judges justly. And that scared the hell out of him. Or actually scared the hell into him, more adequately to be put. Because how do you know that you can meet the standards of God's justness and righteousness? Okay, yes, there's God's mercy. But where are you on that line? And Luther had struggled and struggled and struggled with that. He says, and I was trying to unlock, Romans 1:17 and 18. And then all of a sudden, it occurred to me what Paul was talking about was not an act of righteousness or that by which God judges justly, but it was a passive righteousness. It was the righteousness by which God makes us righteous, or the justice by which God makes us just. So the justitia Dei, the justice of God, is the justice of God that God gives to us and makes us just. It's a passive righteousness. It's a passive justice and justification. That was his discovery. He said, then it was like the whole scriptures opened up to him. And he said, I went through the scriptures in my mind, and I see that all these attributes of God that we've always attributed to God's acts should all be interpreted passively as that which God works in us, that we are the passive recipients of God's actions. He says, it was like the gates of heaven were open to him. He says, and with that, he went back and lectured on Psalms for a second time. Now, the problem there is he had started out, but he had already begun lecturing on Psalms. This is point of departure, and he fits in the indulgences controversy. So it becomes very difficult to determine when that breakthrough occurred in his development. But what for here is most significant, he doesn't say, oh, I discovered justification by faith. That he does not say at all. In his own words, he describes his theological discovery as passive righteousness. That is huge to keep in mind. And it is that then later theologians, historians have referred to as justification by faith. I'm not going to um, launch into my own theological critique of that term and how it has been used. In one way, since the condemnation of Pelagius in 418, the tradition, the Christian tradition, the medieval tradition has always been justification by faith. There's two different types of faith: the fides qua, or the faith by which we believe, and the fides quae, the faith which we believe. Um, I may talk more about this later, I may not, but we can find the formulation that humans are justified by faith before Luther. He was unaware of any of that. Um, but it's really a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation of Luther to say that his Reformation breakthrough and discovery, the point whereby he became the reformer and therefore the Protestant, standing up against Rome, was based on justification by faith. No, he became. No, he didn't became a. He had a major theological discovery for himself that of passive righteousness. I'll later go on to say that he was not the first to discover that righteousness is the passive righteousness, is that which God works in us. But that is how Luther described his breakthrough that has been interpreted later as the point where he became the reformer, standing against Rome. And therefore, you can see, if you have a dating of that discovery in 1518, what do you do with his 95 Theses? No, I'm just going to leave it there. So it almost necessitates an earlier dating rather than a later dating. But and that's why then the almost a consensus before my book was that he had a series of discoveries. But we'll get back to that maybe later. Anyway, wanted to go through those issues, and so that we realize that what Luther says, how Luther describes his discovery. Yes, in 1545. But he looks back on it and he refers to it as a discovery of passive righteousness. That the Justitia Dei is passive for us. It's that by which God makes us just, or that by which God makes us righteous. And for him, that was a huge discovery theologically. The question is, was that a Reformation breakthrough? And that brings me then to this philosophy is beautiful, which is in my own dating of this breakthrough. Now you'll read about this too in Luther in chapter 3, so I'll try to keep this somewhat short. I've already mentioned Luther's attack on Aristotle. You've read the theses against scholastic theology. If you, or when you do, you'll see that Luther, one of them says, it is heresy, was wrong to claim that one can only become a theologian with Aristotle. He says, actually, one can only become a theologian without Aristotle. He had earlier already in 1509 in his notes on Lombard said that Aristotle is to theology as darkness is to light. In that critique of Aristotle, even though we can find it somewhat at times in some members of the Augustinians, but that critique of Aristotle was almost a constant with Luther. And you have to put it in context, and this is when too I talked about last lecture, understanding what these theses were about. They're supposed to be provocative. And so one of the things he's doing is trying to draw the line between philosophy and theology, to say that, what we can argue in philosophy is very different when we're doing theology. So Aristotle can be fine for philosophy, but not for theology. And so the point of these provocative theses were to flesh out those positions. But his general critique of Aristotle, at least seemingly so, explicitly so, with respect to theology is there from the beginning, with one exception. This is when we get to my interpretation of his breakthrough. In a sermon which he gave to his Augustinian brethren in late December, it may have been Christmas, it may have been Christmas Eve, we're not sure exactly, but late December of 1514. So he is, in the midst of lecturing on the Psalms for the first time. He talks about Aristotle's physics. And all of a sudden he exclaims, "This philosophy is beautiful, and it is useful for the highest theology, even if not correctly understood." It's like the only place I've ever seen where Luther praises Aristotle. I'm not saying, is not negative about Aristotle. There find places where you'll say that, Luther, we can find places with Aristotle where he's kind of neutral, or in terms of logic and philosophy is fine. But he doesn't praise him. He doesn't say he's useful for theology. But here he says he's useful for the highest theology, and this is beautiful. Now, to what was he referring? He was referring to Aristotle's physics. We know that Luther had lectured on Aristotle's ethics, which he found particularly vile. But the physics, he made a note. They said he was planning on writing a commentary on Aristotle's physics. He never did. Now, Aristotle's physics are rather complex and wide in scope, but what he's referring to, I think it's book 4, chapter 4, in the physics, where Aristotle makes the distinction between a subject and an object. And he says how he defines them is that the subject is that which undergoes the act. The object is that which acts. So if we want to understand the relationship between an object, that what we study, and the subject, the object is what brings the subject into being. Whether it is, let's say, a tree. We want to study a tree. Tree is the object. Well, the tree acts on us to bring us into being as a being who wants to study the tree. Like, does that make any sense? It's not talking about the birth of the individual as such. It's talking about particularly with respect to our knowledge of. Aristotle will also say, a thing that is known and the knower are identical, or one and the same, become one. They become one insofar as it is known. So, if Christ is the object and we are the subject, it is Christ who brings us into being as followers of Christ. We are passive. Christ, our object, is active. Or God's righteousness. God's righteousness is the active part. We are passive. Something that we undergo. It's not something that we do. Now, that's a huge thing. It's a huge thing. And it certainly was not traditionally part of the traditional medieval Christian theological tradition. We certainly find elements of it with Augustine. We certainly find elements of it with the late medieval Augustinians, but not in general. And in this sense, this is the only case where he praises Aristotle. I say that he made his breakthrough because exactly the same breakthrough he talks about in 1545, passive righteousness, whereas righteousness is not our own righteousness, or it's not God's righteousness, but it is a passive righteousness, is that by which God makes us righteous. And I say that Luther made his theological breakthrough of passive righteousness not as an Augustinian, but as an Aristotelian. Now, I'm somewhat playing with words there, but it's important to note, as is a number of other things. And here we go to the next slide, theological breakthrough, though given it as passive righteousness, was not his Reformation breakthrough. That's the other error of it's almost the entire tradition of Luther scholarship, is equating those two things. Was Luther's discovery a discovery for him? Yes, it was. Had it never been discussed before? No, it was passive righteousness was there before within the Augustinian tradition, maybe not uniformly, but we can find it there. And with the late medieval Augustinians, a lot of them, based on predestination and how God moves in us, blah 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 blah. I'm not going to go into all those innies, so to speak, especially feeling as I do. But for Luther, it was world changing. It changed his world. But it was not his Reformation discovery. It was not his break from Rome. It was not the point that he became the reformer. It was a point of theological discovery for him that affected his theological development. I have up here the list of things. Passive righteousness is not an attack on the church. Passive righteousness was not a refutation of medieval theology. Passive righteousness has an Augustinian tradition. As I said, we can find it there. It's a personal breakthrough, but not a break from Rome. So that is that aspect that we have to see. And I talk about that in chapter 3 in more detail and depth. We have to learn to say, okay, his theological discovery is what? It's not justification by faith. It is passive righteousness in his own words. If we interpret Luther in his own words, that's what it was. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, his theological discovery was not his Reformation breakthrough at all, even if it helped. It was not his Reformation breakthrough at all. It was not counter to medieval theology, even if it was not part of the majority tradition. It was still there and certainly was consonant with the medieval theological tradition and the late medieval theological tradition, and within the Augustinian order, order of hermits of Augustine, it was fairly common. I won't say exclusively, but it was kind of part of their theological tradition. And why? Because it was Augustine's position. Why was it Augustine's position? Because it was Paul's position. And that kind of line, Paul, Augustine, Luther, has been there. And the late medieval Augustinians have been ignored. I mean, Luther does, I think I mentioned in the Heidelberg debate in 1518, reference Gregory of Rimini as one of the best theologians of the Middle Ages, and Gregory was an Augustinian hermit, dies in 1358, 59, no, 58, 59. Anyway, he's one of the greatest Augustinian hermit theologians that there were, and Luther praises him. It's still very unclear whether or not Luther had ever read Gregory before the Leipzig debate, or the Heidelberg, I think it was the Leipzig debate, not the disputation, Heidelberg disputation, but anyway. Oh, there's little evidence that he may have, blah, 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 blah. So it's not completely unheard of. But even that is in consonant with Luther saying, I defend Augustine not because I'm an Augustinian, but because he's the best interpreter of Paul. Luther had some nice things to say about St. Bernard, but that's a whole other issue. which I'm not going to go into. Bernard was a 12th century Cistercian monastic theologian. Um, but I'm not going to go into that too much. It's also questionable how much of Bernard he had read. But that's the issue. And it was uh, not all that revolutionary, even though at the time that Luther has that discovery, it would have been controversial because the theology that Luther was taught was that theology that I talked about last time or the time before, in terms of that pastoral endeavor to just do what is in you, do what is best. It was a theology based on, actually, it was based on Aristotle's ethics and habits. The virtues and vices were habits. Grace became, quantified, as I mentioned, and I think I referred to it, a kind of analogy with, the Harry Potter house cup balls would go up and down and those things because it was based on what you do and what is in you. And Luther says, no, it's not based on what we do, because whatever we do, it can never be enough. It's based on what God does in us. Now, you can go through all kinds of, debates in different positions with the late medieval Augustinians and other late medieval theologians and show how the non-Augustinian theologians had a far greater impact. I mean, I mentioned Gabriel Biel. He was not an Augustinian in any way, shape, or form, but that's one of the main people that Luther was studying. And so Luther's, let's say, almost reassertion of this Augustinian theological position was in conflict with the theology that was being taught and preached at the time, including the theology that Luther was taught when he was studying theology. Because, as I argued before, Luther was not taught the theological tradition of his own order. Now, I have up there, and this is Augustine, the medieval theological tradition. No theologian in the Middle Ages, in the later Middle Ages, would have stood against Augustine. It was all an issue of how Augustine should be interpreted. One scholar even said the Reformation, when it comes down to it, was simply a debate between Augustine's ecclesiology and Augustine's soteriology, or his soteriology is a theology of how one is saved, salvation. So it included predestination and grace, or his ecclesiology, his doctrine of the church and life. Breaking those two into two separate positions, whereas for Augustine himself, they were very much together, but that's a whole other issue of a matter of interpretation of Augustine. But the issue was that the debate was over how Augustine should be interpreted. This great church father from the late 4th, early 5th century still had this huge impact, and Luther took one very particular side of it. I'll come back to that in a bit, maybe. We'll see how that kind of works out and develops. But that is not to say, well, I should say, to say that Luther's breakthrough, which for him was a breakthrough and was a discovery, was not unique. It was not, had not ever, I can't even think of the formulation now, but other people had also argued the position basically and advocated for that position based on Augustine. Is not to say that there's nothing new in Luther, and especially what Luther did with this was new. Here we go, and I'll be talking more about this later too. Luther's originality, separating completely sanctification from justification, extrinsic righteousness. That's a big one, even though it's the last point on the last slide of this lecture, because the whole process of sanctification, as I had talked about it before, and the various positions Luther altered completely. Previously, I talked about this, whether justification comes first and then sanctification, which was the Augustinian position, the position of Jordan of Quedlinburg. As we can see in his exposition of the Lord's Prayer, it's like we are justified. Now what? How do we live our life within this context of the battle between God and the devil? How do we proceed? We know we're adopted sons and daughters of Christ. We know we're justified. Now what? We don't know if we're going to be saved yet because that's something we can't know. But it's only based on God's justification, which God works in us based on God's grace, that we can even begin to live a life of holiness, of becoming holy, of sanctification. Or the other position, we have to become holy in order to be justified. And so the point was to try to live a life that will allow you to become increasingly holy, the process of sanctification, so that at the end of that you will be justified for salvation. Those are the two basic points, and there's all kinds of points in between and the positions in between those and combinations and everything else, but those are the two positions. It was all based on what was in us. What is in you? Now, for Luther, that discovery of passive righteousness was in us. Same thing as with the medieval. It is what God works in us. It's what God brings about and affects in us. But then he went further. Logically makes perfect sense. So you know what? Therefore, it's not our righteousness. It's Christ's. It's nothing that we do. It's what Christ does. Christ is the active partner. We are not. We're just a vessel. And when we look at us, we are a sinful vessel. And our righteousness is not in us or intrinsic to us. It is extrinsic. It is outside of us. It is that object that is Christ. When we started talking about an external righteousness or an extrinsic righteousness, or even then a forensic righteousness, which is a more legal term, but also used at the time. But this approach to say that sanctification has nothing to do with justification did break from the entire medieval tradition. The late medieval Augustinians, those, and there are others too, but the Augustinian tradition primarily, that justification comes first, then sanctification, and it's predestination, justification. This comes from Paul. Those who I have predestined, I've called, and those who called, I've justified. Those who have justified, I've sanctified. By that order, from Romans 8, I believe it is. That was still a basis of becoming holy, how to live a Christian life. They were still related. It's just how were justification and sanctification related? They were related. What Luther did was, for all of those different relationships that had been worked on, he said, no, they're completely separate. One thing, two things. Justification has nothing to do with sanctification. Late medieval Jordan basically has the same doctrine of, we're all sinners. And, it's only those who confess themselves as sinners who are the saints. Luther's, one of the formulations that is always used to encapsulate Luther's doctrine too is simul justus et peccator, that we are simultaneously justified or righteous and thoroughly sinful. That too was a position that Jordan held and other late medieval Augustinians. That goes back to Jesus' parable about the Pharisee and the publican praying. His endurance is by the very fact that the Pharisee says, thank God, that I'm not like that guy. Thank you, dear God, that I'm a righteous person. By that very fact, he's damned. And the publican, by saying, forgive me, Lord, for, I'm a sinner, by that very fact, he's saved. Now, but Luther, though, even went further by saying justification and sanctification are completely different. Think about that for a minute. He'll go on to say, that was what's different between us and the papists. It has nothing to do with how we live. We're as bad as they are. It's an issue of doctrine. It's an issue of doctrine, of theological doctrine. This is important because what Luther does is not only separate justification from sanctification, he also makes Reformation based on doctrine, not based on the individual. When I've talked about the late medieval Reformation or the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, I've always referred to it as, the Reformation of the individual. It's more than a betterment. It is trying to get, to reform things completely, but it's always based on what is in us. It's based on that sanctification process. It's based on how do we make the church holy again? How do we make individuals holy again? Luther says none of that's the case. Reformation is based on doctrine and correct doctrine. And it's with that Luther is distinguished from the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, even as he is a product of it. That is important to keep in mind. And I'm only have gotten through part of the story yet. We'll see more in the lectures of week 7, I believe, when we talk about his real break from Rome, because there was a real break from Rome. There were new things and new changes, but this all provided the basis for it. But this extrinsic righteousness and his discovery of passive righteousness was not as such behind his critique of indulgences, even though it was, because in my dating, his discovery happened in 1514. And there's more evidence I have of that I present in chapter 3 that you can read about. But his critique of indulgences was pastoral and practical. He was critiquing the practice of indulgences more than the theory of indulgences. And he was doing so because he was the pastor of his flock. It wasn't the basis of, I'm standing up for doctrine and for reformation of doctrine. That was coming. But still, with the indulgences controversy, even after his theological discovery, what we're talking about was Brother Martin Luther Augustinian. He was still a faithful, observant Augustinian hermit. That's how he conceived himself. That's how he continues signing his name. He was not a Protestant all of a sudden standing up against the Pope in Rome. He was an Augustinian. And he made his discovery, his great discovery of passive righteousness, great for him as an Augustinian. And it's only slowly over time that he further starts developing this extrinsic righteousness, increasingly so. And so by the time that there is a break, the doctrine for Luther of extrinsic righteousness, and therefore the separation of justification and sanctification, was well on its way to becoming a mature Reformation theology of Luther. But we'll get there when we get there. We haven't gotten there yet. We haven't gotten to his break from Rome, which was a real break, and also was based on two earth shattering, for Luther, earth shattering discoveries. But we'll get there when we get there. Thank you for your patience. Bye bye.